I first met Simon several months ago down at Wilton Park, and I'm very pleased that he's come here today. You all have details of his CV, and I'm not going to embarrass him by talking any more about it. So Simon, I think please crack on.
Thank you, Andrew. It would probably be easier if I stood up, wouldn't it? Because if I point the microphone up here, are we okay for sound if I do that? Okay. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. And welcome to friends and colleagues from Tanzania. What I would like to do is to speak for a little less than 20 minutes so that we can have some time for discussion afterwards. Mainly what I'd like to talk about is my new project, which is called the Good Country Index. I'd like to talk a little bit about the genesis of that index, what it's attempting to measure and why, and then if I leave myself some time at the end, where I hope it's going to lead to. As my biography says, for the last nearly 20 years, I've been very interested in the images of countries and the relationship of national image and national performance. I'm often accused of being the person who invented the awful phrase nation brand. This is a phrase which I carelessly spawned in the late 90s and have never stopped wishing that I hadn't. It was an awful word. But what I meant by it was something really very simple, that in the age of globalization, all countries are effectively competing against each other for a large number of things. They're competing for tourists, they're competing for investment, they're competing for talent, and they're competing for the attention and the respect of the media. They're competing for labor, they're competing for cultural, diplomatic, social, and political relations. And so, in effect, I claimed in this rather hot-headed paper that I wrote in 1998, the world has effectively turned into a gigantic supermarket where country is competing against country for the increasingly scarce attention of a number of consumers. As I say, I wish I hadn't said it, but the phrase caught on, and nation brand gradually, somehow or other, turned into nation branding, which is quite a different idea. I'm not quite sure what it is, but it sounds to me like a promise. It sounds like a promise to any government that if they don't happen to like the image of their country in the world, they can artificially fix it with some kind of marketing trick. In other words, if you've got a country that doesn't rank very highly, or people don't think very much of, or indeed that people don't think about at all, then there are a number of wonderful tools within the commercial marketplace that you can use and make yourself as famous as Nike or Apple in a matter of weeks. This is obviously nonsense. It clearly doesn't work. And yet that word branding is so magical and so mysterious, and so few people really have any idea what it means, if indeed it means anything at all, that the phrase unfortunately caught on. Nation branding today, in 2014, is a very, very widespread pathology. There are enormous numbers of countries, in Africa as elsewhere, that are spending large amounts of taxpayers' money or donors' money on trying to manipulate the image of their country in the hope that it will produce them better trade, better tourism, better this and better that. More respect, in other words. Now, I've been researching this field as a researcher, as an academic, as well as a practitioner for, as I said, 20 years. And I've been looking all over the world for one single example of a country, a city, or a region that has demonstrably, measurably succeeded in changing its international reputation by 1 millimeter as a result of some form of communications, and I'm still looking. I haven't found one single example. And yet almost every month one can find examples of governments spending, as I say, astonishing sums of taxpayers' money in attempting to do just that. I think this is rather shocking. I think it's actually quite scandalous. Call me old-fashioned, but I think that if a government is spending taxpayers' money on anything at all, it ought to be measurable and transparent and accountable. And yet when it comes to this kind of private sector magic of branding, nobody seems to think it's necessary to measure it. So until further evidence arises, I will continue to believe that countries earn their reputations, they don't artificially construct them. In fact, if I may be allowed a moment of bad taste, if nation branding really worked, we'd be living in the Third Reich today, because nobody understood branding better than Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels. When it came to the logos, the slogans, the songs, the uniforms, the communications, the marketing. They were exceptionally good at it. Did they succeed in branding their country worldwide? No. They only succeeded in branding it temporarily for their own citizens. And that's because propaganda can work when you control all the channels of communication reaching your audience as they did. Globally, propaganda is impossible, because no matter how hard you try, you can never control more than a tiny fraction of all the channels of communication reaching your audience. So, communications don't work. What does work? Well, back in 2005, I launched a survey that tried to measure the images of countries, because this had never been done before. And in partnership with an American research firm, I launched a survey called the Nation Brands Index. I hadn't learnt by that stage that this was a dangerous word. I thought it was rather a cool word, and so I used it. That survey has continued every year since 2005. I've discovered recently that it is actually the third or fourth largest social survey ever conducted. This took me by surprise, but I'm polling a very large number of people around the world every year with a very large number of questions about a very large number of countries. And the data mounts up. And by last year, I discovered I'd collected 200 billion data points about what ordinary people around the world, nearly 70% of the world's population, thinks about the other countries in the world, and to an extent, why they think that. And the extent, the depth, the breadth of their ignorance and their prejudice is quite shocking. You really have to look at the data to get a full appreciation of how little people actually know about other countries, how little they care on the whole about other countries, but how much they believe about other countries. Almost every country on earth, or at least the majority of them, have an image with which they are saddled in the minds of other people. It's enormously hard to change it. Lord knows where it comes from, but there it is, and it has a dramatic impact on the way that they perform. So back in 2011, I decided I was going to take a year off and spend that time exploring this enormous database of 200 billion data points, because I never had time to look at it properly. And I had a suspicion that some of the secrets of the universe might be hidden in that gigantic collection of data. And to cut a long story short, what I discovered, indeed, that quite an interesting secret was hidden in all of that data. What I wanted to discover was, if national image is so important in the modern world for competitiveness and for everything, and indeed it is, where does that image come from? What makes people admire one country more than another? Is it because they think that country is richer, or more beautiful, or more powerful, or more dignified? Well, what the study told me was that there are basically 5 reasons why people admire other countries. I call this the Mars model, M-A-R-S-S, just to remind me, because otherwise I'll forget what the 5 criteria are. M is morality. People may admire countries because they think they're good, whatever they mean by that. And of course, it's entirely subjective. What a 14-year-old in Afghanistan thinks is a good country is quite different from what a 72-year-old widow in Vancouver thinks is a good country. Nonetheless, do I think this country is good? Do I think it's bad? Do I think it has a good influence on the world or a bad influence on the world? That's one of the criteria. The second one, the A, is aesthetics. Do I think it's an attractive country? When I picture it in my mind, do I picture a country that's nice to look at, with nice-looking people, nice-looking culture, nice-looking buildings and cars and products? Or do I think it's ugly, full of ugly people and ugly things? The R is relevance. Is this a country that has some impact on my life? So, for example, sitting here in the United Kingdom, I personally might be very interested in Uruguay, but perhaps the majority of other people around me in the United Kingdom may not be very interested in Uruguay, because in the end, it's unlikely to have much of an impact on their daily lives in the UK. So that question of relevance is really quite significant. I might think that the United States is much more relevant, because what they do and what they don't do, and which president is sitting in the White House, might indeed have a direct impact in my life sooner or later. The first S is sophistication. Do I regard this as being a modern, technologically advanced country where they can do electronics, where they have social media, where they have modern products? Or is it an old-fashioned, primitive country where they're still ploughing the fields with oxen? And the last S is strength. Do I see this as a country that has what Professor Joseph Nye would call hard power? In other words, does it have a big army, a big economy, a big land area, a big population? Do they have the strength to impose their will outside their own borders? Or is it a weak country, which may be beautiful, which may be attractive, but has no real power in the world. So those are the 5 drivers which, quite honestly, subconsciously affect, it turns out, our perceptions and our prejudices about other countries. And if you score high on all of those, you will be more admired. And as a result of being more admired, you will do better in the globalized world. That is the chain of consequence. But the most interesting discovery of all is that when you compare the drivers, those 5 drivers, one against another, you find that by an enormously wide margin, the most significant of all is the first one, morality. This is most unexpected. I would have thought, I'm not a cynic, I hope, but I would imagine that people admire countries primarily because they're beautiful, or because they're rich, or because they're successful. No, it turns out that the main reason why people admire a country is because they think it exerts a benign influence on the rest of the world. And when you think about that, perhaps after a while you begin to understand that it's not so unexpected after all. In a way, it's kind of self-interest. Because a good country, a country that respects the environment, a country that doesn't abuse human rights, a country that doesn't wage war on its neighbours or on other more distant countries, is a country I don't have to worry about. It's a country that won't keep me awake at night. Norway, the classic good country. Everybody thinks Norway is good, and they're not wrong. It is good. So I don't go to bed at night fearful that I'm going to be aroused at 3 a.m. by Norwegian terrorists standing around my bed. Norway is a country I can safely ignore. And we as a species, alas, are not very cosmopolitan. And we prefer to ignore other countries. And therefore, a country that we can safely ignore is likely to be the country that we admire most. Of course, there are many, many exceptions. Of course, we can regard a country as really rather evil, but still trade with it. And it can still perform very well if it has a lot of hard power. I don't need to name examples, it's pretty obvious. But for the vast majority of countries in the middle, from the 10th richest to the 10th poorest, you probably find that this is the dynamic which is at work. Now, when I discovered that, to summarize childishly, people prefer good countries, I thought to myself, how fascinating. And I wonder whether those perceptions of whether countries are good or not actually correspond to reality. Because I know, for example, that most people admire Canada, according to my survey, because they think that Canada is a great friend to the environment. Now, a lot of environmentalists would challenge that very vigorously. And they would say Canada is by no means a friend to the environment. And yet the majority of the world's ordinary population regards Canada as one of the greenest countries on earth. And there are many other cases. African countries, to give one particularly flagrant example, on almost every category are regarded as being less good than they really are. The vast majority of African countries labour under a negative reputation, which in many, many cases they've done nothing to deserve. For this, I partly blame our friends Bob Geldof and Bono and all of the aid agencies, who for years and years and years have been branding the whole of Africa as one hopeless basket case, and has been teaching people in the West for decades that these countries are good for nothing except charity. And this has damaged the image of African countries in a really rather long-term way. And so the perception really doesn't correspond to the reality whatsoever. As a matter of fact, on that single question of contribution to the environment, according to my survey of perceptions, the Nation Brands Index, the world's population, on average, thinks that the greenest country on earth is Canada, and the least green country on earth is Angola. And if you look at the World Bank's CO2 emissions, just as one example of green behavior, it's fascinating. It's exactly the other way around. Angola is one of the least polluting countries on earth, one of the lowest emitters of CO2, and Canada is one of the worst. So that's a very striking example of how perception and reality are almost completely reversed. So here we're in a rather dangerous situation, aren't we? We've got gigantic economic forces like tourism and trade and investment, which are directed to a significant degree by perceptions which may be entirely misplaced. So this is rather an interesting state of affairs. And for any government that has the prosperity and competitiveness of its own nation at heart, it's something that they really ought to be thinking about quite seriously. And to go back to that awful paper I wrote in 1998, there was a particularly awful sentence that I wrote in it, which I've regretted more than any other. Lord knows why I keep on quoting it. But the quotation was, for this reason, governments in the 21st century have to be brand managers as much as they are policymakers. It was an awful statement, but what I meant by it, I think, was quite clear. Governments today need to understand that when they come into office, they inherit a sacred responsibility for the good name of their nation, because that's one of its most valuable assets in the modern world. And when they leave office, they have to hand down the name of their nation to their successor in office in as good condition as they found it. And that's part of the way in which they will be judged by posterity. Did you trash our name, or did you somehow glorify it? So, I thought to myself, we've got a measure of perception here. What we don't have is a measure of reality. I don't know, really and truly, how good countries are. It seems like an impossible thing to calculate. But I would like to know, what do countries contribute to the global commons? After all, we live in an age where most of the really interesting challenges we're facing are global challenges, whether it's climate change, or nuclear proliferation, or pandemics, or terrorism, or human rights, or human trafficking, or economic crisis, or narco-trafficking. I could go on and on and on. All of these, as we well know, are planetary problems on a planetary scale. Most attempts to try to fix these problems on a national level fail because the problems are connected in so many other countries. It's like that game which I think is called whack-a-mole. You hit the mole on the head and another one pops up somewhere else. You can't resolve any of these issues on a national level. Patently, they can only be resolved through cooperation and collaboration. This is what the United Nations, bless its heart, tries to encourage us to do, with limited success. This is what the Commonwealth, bless its heart, tries to encourage us to do, with limited success. This is what the European Union, with remarkable success, has succeeded in doing, in my opinion, in a few noticeable cases in the past 30, 40, 50 years, but it needs to look to its laurels. So cooperation and collaboration has clearly got to be the answer. But as long as countries are competing against each other on a very 19th century model, it seems to me we're going to get nowhere. And so we come to a kind of crossroads in the argument. On the one hand, national governments are doing nothing but considering their own interest as a nation state. How can we be more competitive against others? How can we win more trade and more tourists and more investment from our neighbours or from our other competitors around the world? And yet at the same time, global challenges decree that nations must cooperate more and more closely together if we're not all to race to perdition, because those global challenges will overwhelm us. And so this was why I decided I would launch the Good Country Index. The Good Country Index is in principle very simple indeed. What it does is it takes 35 existing indicators of national performance. Those 35 indicators come from, it's not data that I've collected, because to collect data from 125 countries would require more resources than I've got. So I go to the organizations that have got the resources. I go to the UN, to the World Bank, to the Red Cross, all the organizations that collect global data and that is reliable and robust. And what I ended up with was 35 data sets that measure interesting external impacts of countries. They're organized in 7 different areas. So you have an area like, for example, peace and security, within which are 5 measurements of what each country on Earth, or rather 125 countries, contribute positively or negatively to international peace and security. Not domestically, but outside their own borders. You have another category, which is the environment and the planet. 5 indicators there which measure how much each country contributes to the global environment and to the planet in general. You have culture, a set of indicators, 5 indicators, which attempt to measure how much each country contributes to global exchange of culture and global cultural wealth rather than purely domestic production. So there are 7 of those categories with 5 data sets in each one. I won't go through them because it will take too long. And I basically mashed them all together, which sounds easy, was in fact about 2 years' hard work. But we ended up with a ranking of 125 countries, which measure per capita, or rather per dollar of GDP, so relative to the size of their economy, how much they contribute to the global commons and how much they steal. So the countries at the top are basically net contributors to humanity. They can hold up their heads and they can say, I'm proud to come from where I come from. Wherever I travel in the world, people should feel glad that my country exists because we give as much as we take, or if not more. The countries at the bottom of the index should look very hard at what they're doing because they're effectively free riders. They're letting the global commons be looked after by everybody else, and they're only thinking of themselves. So 125 countries, in rank order, the vast majority of the countries at the top of the index are Western European. Number 1 is Ireland. rather interestingly, per dollar of GDP, relative to the size of its economy, in 2010, which was the point at which most of the data was collected, division, Ireland gave more to the rest of the world than any other country, which is quite an interesting state of affairs, considering that 2010 was possibly the very worst year for Ireland. Indeed, it was at the point at which its government debt was at its highest point. So I think there's something rather delightful about this fact that in the moment of its direst domestic need, it somehow or other didn't forget its international obligations. Ireland remembered how to be a global citizen. As I say, most of the remains of the countries at the topmost level are Western European. Now, I've been accused by many people of European bias, whatever that means. But the reality, I suspect, is that the reason why European countries come on top is because, as I was saying earlier on, they have the habit of cooperation. It's in their blood. They know about multilateralism, and they've had some experience to show that it works. Most other countries don't. The result in the index which pleased me personally most was the fact that Kenya came in at 26th position overall, inside the top 30. This means that Kenya, despite being a country with a very small economy relative to the other countries in the index, still managed to rank very, very high in terms of its contribution to humanity. Tanzania, incidentally, comes 63rd, also a very creditable position, well inside the top half of the index. These two rankings, I think, help to show that this is not about money. Lots and lots of people have said to me, well, surely only rich, successful countries can afford the leisure and the spare resources to worry about the rest of the world. I refute that argument. I don't think this has necessarily got anything to do with money at all, not least because I don't measure very many financial indicators at all. Yes, foreign aid may have something to do with how much money you've got, but foreign aid is only a small part of it. A lot of it is to do with how good an international citizen you are as a country. How many refugees do you accept? Kenya, for example, takes in many more than most Western European countries. Perhaps not willingly, but it does. And it's to do with how well you treat the environment. Relatively little to do with how much money you've got, and an awful lot to do with how much you care about the planet. And for indicator after indicator, you can see that it's possible to be a friend to humanity without necessarily having a lot of money to spend. So the consequences of this index have been quite striking. What I've attempted to do by launching this index is not to produce an exhaustive or complete measurement of what each country contributes to humanity, because that would be impossible. But what I have attempted to do is to start a process, a conversation, where people start asking themselves, and more importantly, their politicians, a different set of questions. Instead of always asking, what's in it for me, they might start beginning to ask, what's in it for we? Because unless they start asking that latter rather than that former question, then surely, as Benjamin Franklin nearly said, we shall all hang separately. So I'll leave it at that, and that gives us a little bit of time for discussion. Thank you.